we have Josh Kullis from Auros Knowledge Systems to talk about walking the walk. And he's going to walk on up here now. Yes, let's go. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amy. Let me get plugged in here. Okay, so like Amy said, we're going to talk a little bit about how we use the software to manage many different processes at Auros Knowledge Systems. So we started doing this presentation, I think, back in 2016, and have been fortunate enough to come back and give it every single conference since then. And what we've been able to do is kind of talk a little bit about the value that the knowledge-aware approach brings to our organization, but in addition to that, how we've matured over time. So we'll start today and we'll kind of go through some of that background and talk about the story that we've had to this point, where we started, where we are, and then we'll give some updates on some of the use cases that are more prominent within our organization. So the first one is our seed project. So if you're not familiar with a seed project, it's the way that we onboard workflows at organizations. So if we find a new use case, a new process, we do what we call a seed project. Sometimes we're doing them with the people in this room and they don't even realize it because it's all happening behind the scenes, because sometimes the terminology can feel heavy. But the idea behind it is there are a lot of best practices that we want to make sure that we're taking into account. And if we do violate them or we make decisions that maybe are not the most ideal, we at least want to make sure that we're taking them into consideration. So we'll talk a little bit about our seed project process, how we've kind of transitioned into this assessment first approach that we've talked a little bit about last year and then this year as well. Then we'll talk about customer growth and expansion. So we made a strong push a couple of years ago to formalize that process in Auros, make sure that we're doing it consistent across the different customer bases, that we have somewhere when we learn something at one customer or when we make a mistake, which we never do, at another customer, make sure that we avoid that or make sure that we make those things that are happening in a positive nature recur, right? So we'll talk a little bit about the growth and expansion process and how that's matured. And then the last thing is our software factory. So we have a pretty big transition that we're undertaking right now, and it's a transition from managing things through issues and migrating them into assessments. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'll give some statistics about just what our implementation looks like in general. So from a background perspective, our timeline, like I said, we started our actual implementation when we started using the software in a very pointed way was 2014. So from there to 2017, these are some of like the major processes that we put in. We'll highlight some things here that maybe are a little bit different than what some of the customers do. So our software factory, we talked a little bit about that. We'll then get into some of the details around it a little bit later. Seed project. But we also manage our hiring process. So when we look for new candidates, a majority of the Auros employees that are in this room today were actually hired through the process that's in Auros. And then our opportunity pursuit process, which is the business development activity that happens prior to a seed project, that also got put in within that 3 or 4 year span of time. Then the next 2 years, we started focusing on strategic planning for the organization. So we did that in a lot of different ways. We found some value in putting that in Auros, being able to establish this consistent set of standard work, make sure that we're doing it effectively across different terms, whether it's a quarter or a year. So that provided us a lot of benefit. That led to customer health actually being measured in Auros. So we have scorecards that get sent out to the application engineers who are responsible for the customer account every quarter. And we're tracking that customer health, and then we can see the performance over time. In Auros, we can identify common patterns, common trends. So that's been really beneficial for us as well. Then I talked a little bit about customer growth and expansion. We'll get into that here momentarily. Sorry. Then the next couple years, We started to implement our information security management process through Auros. One of the things that you might have heard yesterday in the introductory course, or you've maybe heard before, an indicator that an assessment can be valuable for you would be the need for audit. Right? So when we start having to adhere to certain security standards, and we have groups that'll come in from a security perspective, and IT departments want to understand how we manage information, proprietary things, that kind of stuff, it's really important for our processes to be auditable. So we migrated our information security management into Auros, and then as an expansion of our software factory, starting to manage our actual backlog in the software as well. And then last year, we introduced a couple different things, some knowledge-aware audits, software factory standard work. We'll talk a little bit about the standard work and the audits, how they've become integrated into what we do. But those were kind of the major use cases that we introduced last year. So now to give a little bit of an update on some of the use cases, the first one we'll talk about is the SEED project. So we started probably about 18 to 24 months ago, really focusing on this assessment-first approach. We went out, we canvassed a lot of the different organizations that are using the software, and what we found is there are some very common patterns. There were challenges that certain groups that approach things a certain way were facing on a regular basis, and then there were groups that were approaching things from this assessment-first perspective that didn't face those types of challenges. So we wanted to take a look at our SEED project process. It looked like this about 24 months ago. We started to look at the standard work, see how we could adjust to actually integrate this assessment-first approach. What we found is we were talking about the value and the importance of an assessment all the way up until the part where we started to do work with customers. And then the first activity we had them doing was authoring knowledge packets. And what we realized is when we stopped and we switched that, the knowledge packets became, instead of something that you had to do at the beginning to get off the ground, the assessment was the focus, identify where it needs to exist within your process, and then the K-Packs just kind of fall into place, right? You have this valuable thing that will allow you to continuously improve, but you can't use it until you get knowledge into it, right? So we started with the assessment. There were a lot of different things that were beneficial about that for us. So what we've done is we kind of took our process, we migrated it, and this initial configuration that you can see there on the left-hand side, it used to take us between 4 and 6 weeks to get to the point where we were running through assessments in Auros with the customer. We now are able to do that in about 45 to 60 minutes. So the reduction in getting people into the software, now there isn't the fidelity of information, obviously, right, because those knowledge packets haven't been created yet. But as you start to experience the software through the perspective of an assessment, the perspective that you have when authoring the knowledge packets changes significantly. The focus is no longer on capturing everything that you know, but it's rather identifying the things that people need to know when and where they need to know them. So we've started with this particular process. As we've gone through that, we learned quite a bit, excuse me, we learned quite a bit about just the assessment in general and how this approach can be kind of made more efficient. So for this particular step, we used to have knowledge packets, and our conformance palette was, did you do this or did you not do this? So it was simply measuring completion. What we now have started to develop, because we've gone through this assessment first process, is our conformance palette. We've had to migrate over to a qualitative palette where it's good, okay, bad, because we've been able to introduce these knowledge models. So as we started to approach things from an assessment first perspective, we started to learn a lot more about that. We started to be able to develop knowledge models around these different best practices, which then drive not just to a list of items that we need to complete, but rather have those things been completed well or not. So this is one example of continuing to use that knowledge-aware approach, how it's allowed us to actually mature the knowledge beyond just a list of things we need to do, and start to put some parameters around these items that need to be completed on whether or not you're doing them well, or if maybe you're introducing risk to a project. Okay, so the next use case that we'll update a little bit, there's not a whole lot of maturity necessarily of the knowledge here. So this is at not quite the same state that the seed project process is, but we have a process. We introduced this last year, so I think this is probably the second time that people have seen it, or at least the second time it's been in the public domain. The thing that's been extremely eye-opening for this particular process for us is that we never had an impression that we were performing poorly, right, with customer growth and expansion. We always thought that our people were doing a good job. What this has really been able to do is identify the positive things that people were doing at certain accounts, identify the things that maybe could have been done better, and put them all into one place. The consistency for the way that we support a customer like Eaton that Andre represented earlier, or General Motors, or Navistar, is now far more consistent than it was previously. And it's because we have this place, every team is consistently going through the same process. We have traceability for it. We have somewhere that we can go and we can put things that we learn, make sure that they're going to come up the next time we go through it. And we've actually, with that scorecard that we put out, we've actually seen an increase in customer health performance of over 30%. And that's just in the last 12 months. So we still have, I'd show you the actual numbers, but we still have a long way to go so that we can improve. But the improvement has been significant, and it's, I can't imagine how we would do our customer growth and expansion without this central place and this consistent process that people are now walking through. The one other thing that we'll talk about is this strategic planning activity we do with every customer now. When we first started doing it, it took us around 3 to 4 hours to do it for each customer. We now are going through the second iteration with the customers that we did it with back then. And now these particular meetings and the development of these plans is taking about 45 to 90 minutes. So we've been able, with the consistency, the repetition, to really make this process a lot more efficient. And then the last one is the software factory standard work. So again, we introduced this last year as well. Some improvements that we've made. We used to have issues that would track all the different tickets. It's a very common thing to have tickets that you assign to software engineers. They do the work. It happens over here, and they come back and say they're done. Well, we were not any different than most organizations that do those types of things. So we had a long list of items we needed them to track, and we needed to report out on various things for it. So we had issues. They represented the different software changes that we did. And we introduced this standard work so that everything that was happening over here was now traceable. We're able to bring people on board and educate them in less amount of time. We're able to then also track the application of information and know what's being used, what isn't being used, maybe why something was done, why it wasn't done. So we introduced this assessment that represented a lot of the fields that you see in that orange box on the left. The thing that we then started to experience is we're assigning tickets to software engineers. They're then coming over and creating the assessment to track their standard work, but it's not being reflected in both places. So we ended up creating 2 places for people to track their work, which presented some challenges for us. So we're right now, we just about 4 weeks ago, we made this migration fully over to the assessment control. And what we found when we had these 2 different places was there were certain things that got overlooked because they were tracked in the issue. There were certain levels of reporting that we weren't able to get out of the issue that we can get out of the assessment. So as we've migrated over, we still have to migrate metrics. We have to understand how all this impacts a lot of different areas of the business. But as we've migrated the software engineers to now, instead of getting a ticket assigned to them, they just become the evaluator of an assessment. It delivers all the work that they need right to them. They're able to track all their work in that one place. We're able to then see it and report it in real time. And they don't have these 2 places that they have to then report out what they've done. The benefit that we get from this, that the issue, we kind of hit the ceiling of the issue functionality, was that standard work, the guidance that we're able to provide to people, and then the reporting as well, the evidence of how they applied best practices. The issue, you can do that, but it's not quite as straightforward. The guidance isn't quite as user-friendly. So we've migrated this over to assessments. We're in the middle of doing that right now. And one of the benefits that we've gotten out of this activity, and really all the activities that we go through and all the workflows that we mature in Auros, is it not only benefits our business, it doesn't only make our people better, but it also gives us insight into the challenges that customers can face if they make one decision versus the other during the early stages of a seed project. So the best practices that we talked about in the seed project process a little bit earlier, those have evolved significantly as we've made these migrations from issues to assessments, or from a completion conformance palette over to this qualitative conformance palette. We now know if you choose completion at the beginning, here are the impacts they can have downstream. If you choose qualitative scores, here are the impacts that they can have downstream, or the things that you may not be able to accomplish and have to migrate over to eventually. So it's been extremely beneficial for us as an organization to not only make our group better, make our employees better, but also give us some extra insight into just the implementation that everyone here is also facing when they go through one of these onboarding activities. So to wrap this up, I think I'm doing well. Our usage at a glance, we now have 45 distinct workflows in Auros. We had about 40 last year. Our assessment controls, we're approaching 20,000. We haven't quite hit it. I think we're at like 19,800 and some as of last week. But we had about 15,000 last year. So as we've started to migrate to these areas, our use of assessments and the value that we're seeing has just kind of skyrocketed over the last year or so. Our knowledge packets have stayed steady around 15,000. And I think the reason for that, I don't know that I have actual data to back this up, so this is more of an opinion, is as we've started to learn a lot more, we've been able to refine these knowledge packets, and we don't need a lot more of them. We just need the ones we have to get better. And we've been able to improve those over time. Our distinct users are about the same, so we're showing that our knowledge packets, our user base staying the same, but we're still able to achieve additional value. We're still able to get more value out of the software, even though we're not adding people and we're not necessarily adding knowledge packets. And then our events on a daily basis went from about 2,500 in 2022 to about 3,000 per day this year. And that's it. Any questions?
Mm-hmm. We do. We have questions. Josh, coming.
Yeah, no problem.
Good. How do you configure an assessment without K-PACs in the assessment first seed projects?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one of the ones that a lot of the application engineers and other people in our organization were kind of asking when we proposed to do this. We create shell K-PACs. So we know that you have best practices, maybe you have guidelines, you might have, who knows what it is, whatever the use case calls for. We create shell K-PACs and we just we put a title in that says best practice 1, best practice 2, best practice 3. And it doesn't take very long for that assessment process and the iteration through it to help us understand how the knowledge packets are best authored in order to be evaluated by someone, as opposed to authoring them for someone to find knowledge, look it up, and potentially apply it.
And do you see issues going away in the future and migrating everything to assessments?
I personally don't. I think that there are benefits to using the issue management module versus the assessment module, and there's obviously benefits to the assessment versus the issue. I don't see a scenario where having an issue, applying the knowledge that comes to you in an assessment doesn't need to be addressed. So we've started to kind of formulate, what is the definition or the actual intent of the issues management module? And I think it's hard for me to see a place where we don't have standard work that's occurring, and if you have a problem applying that, needing to reach out to a subject matter expert or needing to collaborate on how to improve or how to make that particular thing better. So for that use case, I don't think that it'll go away. I do think that we're going to start to see a lot of activities migrate from issues over to assessments, because that issue is going to hit a certain point where it doesn't have the capability that the assessment has.
Good. Any in-person questions from your voice? Not in this round. We're ready for a lunch break, which is what is coming next. So thank you so much, Josh. Really appreciate that. Great stuff.